So the whistleblowers, they come out and basically say that, the extent of the spying in Arctic frost was well beyond what anybody even knew, as bad as we thought it was. Members of Congress, Jack Smith issuing subpoenas like it's candy at Halloween, and it was Boasberg who was signing off on a lot of these subpoenas.
Yes. So, it's egregious. So you had the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Department of Justice, Postal Service, and the National Archives conspiring together to put anybody who was really close to MAGA challenging the 2020 election under criminal investigation. They used offices and special agents in charge signed off on this at almost every FBI office in the nation. Rather than saying, hold on a second, this is unbelievable, and let me get into why this should have hit every red flag known to man. They were saying if you publicly advocated for challenging the election or contesting it or questioning it in any manner, or if you donated to somebody who did, or if you were a lawyer who advocated it in court, that they were calling that a federal crime worthy of 20 years in federal prison. They said anyone who filed an open records request should be under criminal investigation because they said an open records request was a crime. They said filing an election lawsuit in court was a crime. Filing a petition with your state legislator was a crime. Filing a petition for an electoral challenge with Congress was a crime. Publicly speaking about the issue, they said, was a crime. Donating to somebody who supported any of these issues was a crime. And they put all of us under massive investigation. They stole people's phone records. They stole people's financial records. They basically wiretapped and spied on them en masse. I mean, this was a massive effort to entrap and ensnare and ultimately imprison as many of the core MAGA supporters as they possibly could. That scuzzbag, crazy, kooky lawyer, Mark Bankston, down there in Texas, who was part of the Sandy Hook plaintiffs' cases. This is the guy that I said he had a free ticket to the nut house and the Uber driver accidentally dropped him off to law school, and that's how he got his law degree. Well, his name shows up in these files, sharing discovery from the discovery, which supposedly never was given, by Alex Jones. That all of Alex Jones's phone records were being shared with this committee because it appears Bankston was neck deep in this criminal activity. Not a big surprise if you understood what the Sandy Hook cases were all about. This was the most systemic violation of civil rights and civil liberties by our Justice Department and Federal Bureau of Insurrection in American history. The closest you can get before this is COINTELPRO, but this is COINTELPRO on steroids and at scale. And what was amazing is how many FBI agents signed off on this without protest. How many Justice Department attorneys signed off on this without protest. And the only reason they're doing anything about it now is because they didn't limit themselves to unelected officials. They didn't limit themselves to Trump and everyone else. They also went after a bunch of senators. And they took senators' phone records, senators' financial records, other records of the Senate. And here there's a specific federal law that requires that information must be disclosed to the senators being spied on.
All units proceed to your post assignments. All units proceed to your post assignments.
Yeah, baby, it's episode 5 of Probable Cause on November 4th, 2025. You might even call this Election Day or Election Night. And who better to have with us on this holiday? I don't know if you'd call it a holiday, but sort of. But Brad Smith, who is the former chair of the Federal Election Commission, one of the nation's foremost campaign finance experts, as well as a First Amendment expert in general. And this, I think, is the third time we've spent quality time together. Nice to see you again, Brad. I see you've grown a beard since the last time.
Good to see you. I have. It's, again, required in retirement that you have to do this.
All right. America's Sweetheart has one of those, too. Greg, what's taking you so long to get on the train?
I can't pull it off for some reason. It never seems to come in.
All right. Well, unlike Robert Barnes, who we saw in the opening there, who called some lawyer a scuzzbag, Brad is a different type of temperament, at least publicly. I don't think, I won't say I know you real well, Brad, but to the extent I do know you, I would say you don't usually call people scuzzbags, or you wouldn't say the FBI is the Federal Bureau of Insurrection, at least publicly. Perhaps with friends, once the second or third glass of wine kicks in, you might say it. Am I right?
Yes, but not to a scuzzbag like you, Jeff.
All right. So I'll take care of the insults. Greg is also very gentlemanly, but me not so much. But let's just comment briefly on the substance of what he was saying. And Greg is himself an FBI whistleblower, so it's appropriate to have both a lawyer and an FBI whistleblower to talk with us tonight, because they're both at issue in that scandal, that emerging scandal. Why don't we start with you, Greg? How do you feel about and why do you think the FBI agents took the whistleblower route instead of going to their superiors? It worked out so well for you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm kind of surprised when he keeps mentioning the FBI agents, in all these field offices signed off on this. And I'm trying to reconcile, what were they supposed I don't understand what he means signs off, because there was nothing to ever sign off on.
Well, doesn't it mean that they have to submit something to the court in order to get the warrant issued?
My understanding is the warrant would have been issued, and then the leads would have been sent out to all the field offices to enforce
but initially, doesn't something have to happen to get the judge to issue a subpoena?
Correct, but at no point are agents signing off on paperwork. They're just following the direction.
It might be just a figure of speech. I don't know.
Okay, maybe that's what it was, because I was confused when he kept saying all these field offices signed off on it. It's like, you don't sign off on anything. If it comes out of headquarters or comes out of another office, and you're given the assignment.
I think it means they're playing along with it.
Okay. That's what was causing my confusion, because I couldn't figure out why. You don't have to approve anything. You don't have to review anything and authorize it. You're just following the directive of the Department of Justice to enforce a court order to get records is all you're doing. But I'm curious how many actual whistleblowers came forward to Congress or to the IG's office to express their concerns.
Well, what does it say about the FBI that they took the whistleblower path rather than just talking to their supervisors?
They lack confidence in being supported by management. Is what
Finally, I dragged that out of you. That's what I was.
You had to pull it tooth by tooth, but yes, they don't have the confidence in management to support them if they question a directive. Yeah.
Right. Now, Brad, I know you haven't really studied this case all that much, but what's your sense of it? Is Robert Barnes maybe exaggerating, because he's trying to make it seem like it's one of the biggest scandals ever?
Well, as you know, Jeff, I believe there's fraud in elections. I also think that the 2020 election was won by Biden. I don't think fraud swung that election at all, or even close to it in the end. And I think when people make those kinds of allegations, they've spent a good 5 years looking hard for evidence and never really come up with something that would stand up in court. And I think that just leaves us where we are. The one thing that has always given me a little bit of pause in making that strong, assertion is the entire reaction of the Democratic establishment and the Biden campaign and so on in the immediate aftermath of that election, when their view was automatically, it's like, it's illegitimate to question this win. You can't question this win. You can't do it. Instead of saying something like, we're sure our wins, we won. We're sure it's going to hold up in court. But if they want to do a contest, that's their right. They have a legal right to do it. Instead, they acted as if the very act of challenging an election result was somehow an assault on democracy. And that was totally wrong. And what follows out of the 6th of January and the investigation is somewhat the same. There's no doubt that some people got carried away. They invaded the Capitol. They committed criminal acts. And they deserved, I think, to be punished. But there's also no doubt that a great many people did none of those things. And there's no doubt, I think the real scandal comes in the way the Democrats tried to use that to do this kind of wide-ranging investigation. So as you mentioned, I haven't followed the Arctic frost news of the last few days particularly closely, because to be honest, there's a part of me that kind of says, of course. I mean, we sort of knew that already, that there was a tremendous overkill in what the Democrats tried to do. Remember, they surrounded the Capitol with, National Guardsmen for months. They, were throwing the book at all these people in court and giving them maximum jail sentences and so on. And so none of this surprises me to learn that they were trying to tie in every Republican they can. And by the way, we've seen it in other cases. Years ago, I and the Institute for Free Speech worked some on cases in Wisconsin where the prosecutor in Wisconsin used vague allegations to try to he was doing, midnight raids on individuals' homes if they were at all connected with the Republican Party or conservative groups. This is becoming, unfortunately, all too common a method of going after one's political opponents. So I'm not really up to date on the specific allegations now being made in Arctic frost, but my initial reaction is kind of to say, yeah, what's the news there? We know this, and unfortunately, some people have decided that they don't think this kind of thing is news or is worthy of investigation.
Excuse me, Jeff. Brad, I do have a question, and I'm not. I don't ever consider myself a conspiracy theorist. But with the elections, I've seen these graphs where it would appear like 60 million people voted for Barack Obama. And then all of a sudden it spikes to like 81 million for Joe Biden. And then it drops back down to like 60 million for Trump. And I'm always curious, like, what created this huge disparity in the voting bloc where he campaigned from his basement. He didn't give many public appearances. The ones that they broadcast looked like they had sort of tepid turnouts. But there's no doubt when they show it like as a bar graph that there was this huge uptick for him. And I always just feel like that's so sketchy. Like, I'm skeptical that he could have garnered that amount of turnout based on his campaign.
You weren't seduced by Biden mania, huh? You just didn't fall.
I'm trying to evaluate it like from a neutral perspective.
No, it's a good question. And one of the things I think we always need to keep in mind is 10,000 people attending a rally who would walk across broken glass in their bare feet or crawl across it on their hands and knees to vote for Trump are worth no more. In fact, they're worth less than 10,200 Biden voters who are totally apathetic, but really kind of fear Trump. And in this huge get out the vote effort, and the Democrats had a massive get out the vote effort, finally voted. And remember in 2020, there was a massive use of COVID to try to alter election laws.
Yeah, that's true. Yes.
Voting. And see, one of the problems with a lot of those things is in a broad colloquial sense, we might say the election was fraudulent or rigged, but it wasn't in a legal sense. That is if the Secretary of State in a state says, oh, well, we're going to let people vote this way, right? And a court doesn't stop it, at least not before the election. And you're a voter, you go vote that way. You haven't committed fraud. It's sort of not fair. So like I say, colloquially, we might call it fraud, but in the actual legal sense, people casting illegal ballots, I don't think so. And note that Trump's votes also spiked in that election. He got a lot more. So I can understand it. But again, I keep going back to saying, ultimately, with this kind of allegation, we've got to have more than some kind of circumstantial evidence. You've got to have something that will stand up in court, and we just haven't had that.
My friend Steve Scrovan says it's like a Steely Dan. They sold tons and tons of records, but they weren't a very big concert act. And it's sort of the same thing with Biden. The people don't come out to see him in person because it's a boring live act. But just like buying the records, they'll go to the ballot to vote for him. What were you going to say, Greg?
I had a question. It's a little bit off topic, but I think Brad is probably in the best position to have an opinion of it. And I had this conversation with people at the time when they were really pushing during that previous election, all the absentee voting and the early voting, and what would have happened? And I never could get a straight answer on this. If all of these, early voting options were employed, and all of a sudden, Biden just, sort of has like a mini stroke or some medical event where he's obviously now compromised, but he's alive, or he actually passed away, would the vice president have been elected because of that?
Yeah, so you've got me here. I always have to look this up to be sure I'm not speaking out of the side of my mouth. But first, let's suppose Biden's just incapacitated and still.
Yeah.
The electors would be pledged to him, but this is part of what we count on the Electoral College for, that the electors might say, well, I'm not going to vote for a guy who is essentially, out of commission.
Yes.
And they'd cast their votes elsewhere. It becomes even trickier if he passes away. There's the provision, and I don't remember exactly how it reads, but basically it falls to the vice president elect in that kind of case. So, boy, I'm sorry. I wish I'd been prepared for that, because it's one I
didn't mean to ambush you.
Can I just say something? If Brad Smith is confused, then that probably means the election laws are too complicated, and there are too many of them. Is that a fair conclusion?
Well, perhaps this is a constitutional issue in part, because it goes to how the electors vote. But
it's not the statutory controversy.
Yeah, and of course, by the way, states have different rules on what happens if a candidate dies. Some people with long memories remember back in 2000 or somewhere thereabouts, Missouri elected a dead person with the understanding that if he won, the Democratic governor would appoint his wife to the office. And they defeated incumbent John Ashcroft, in fact, with that strategy. It had to be very embarrassing.
Yeah. Okay. I didn't mean to come out of nowhere with the question, but I remember at the time I had that question, and then once we started talking about it, it kind of triggered that memory, and I was like, I never really got a straight answer, and I was curious to see what your take was on it. But thank you.
Let me ask you a question about something you said when you were on Kim Strassel's podcast last month. She's excellent, by the way. I have a feeling you didn't have the January 6th protesters in mind when you said this, but I'd like to find out what you did have in mind. She asked you what sort of issues are on the horizon, what's going to be big in the coming months. And one of the things that you said is actually, you touched on one of my pet peeves, and I wasn't aware at all that anybody's paying attention to it. I'm so happy to hear it, but I'd like to hear a little bit more about it. You said the issue of protesters not being allowed to just protest anywhere and everywhere they feel like it is something that is gaining recognition. And I'm glad to hear that. But why did you say that? And what exactly is going on in that realm?
I don't remember the exact contours. I remember, generally, but I don't remember exactly how we got to that question. But
well, no. She just said what issues are on the horizon, and that was the one you mentioned.
What we've seen in a lot of aspects. For example, this has come up a lot in regards to Palestinian, pro-Palestinian, or anti-Semitic, or anti-Jewish, or anti-Zionist, whatever you want to call them, protests pertaining to the Israeli-Hamas war. And a lot of people say, oh, we're just exercising our right to free speech. Well, your right to free speech does not include barricading people in a cafeteria so they can't leave. Your right to free speech does not include blocking public highways so that other people cannot go about their business. Your right to free speech, of course, does not include violence. It doesn't include kicking and punching counter protesters and that sort of thing. And I think people are getting a little bit tired of this notion that people have that they're engaging in free speech when they actually engage in vandalism or violence or something like that. I think we're seeing a real pushback growing there. And that is probably a positive development. Free speech does not include, vandalizing priceless artwork by throwing stuff on it. That's not free speech. Now, if you want to get your own replica of the artwork and, put it out someplace and then throw stuff at it, you're free to do that.
Yeah. Even this guy, Khalil, who was, sort of like the big poster child for free speech. And I'm thinking maybe he's not the ideal poster child. He was, quote unquote, negotiating or mediating on behalf of his colleagues, his fellow activists who had barricaded themselves into the room in Colombia, which I think might be what you're referring to. And I'm having a hard time imagining what he could have said that is perfectly lawful. How do you negotiate when you're using as leverage an illegal act like that?
Yeah,
I mean, Is that a reasonable suspicion or
Yes,
question?
it's a good point. Actually, by the way, the example I had in mind was cases where Jewish students were barricaded into buildings and were not allowed to leave. But you raised the other one where the protesters would go in and take over a building. Say, well, we're occupying this building and we're not
Yeah.
going to leave. You can't force us out. And again, that's not their right to free speech. You don't have a right to occupy, the university's buildings or anymore in somebody's home. And I think you're exactly right. Once people have done that, I mean, we may be negotiating with them to avoid the violence of sending, armed police in, but we're not negotiating their free speech rights. They are beyond their free speech rights at that point.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what he said in this negotiating role, but it's just hard to imagine that he wasn't. If he was actually negotiating in any way, that means he was using as leverage the situation to try to get what he and the activists want. I mean, he wasn't like a hostage negotiator, like when the police are called in, where clearly they're not like neutral or something. They're clearly on the police side. They've decided this is a crime and they're just trying to get the situation under control.
And there's a related phenomenon to this, which is the belief of a lot of people who engage in civic protest, like Martin Luther King style protest, Gandhi type protest, that there shouldn't be any consequences for that. And of course, the moral force that King and Gandhi had with their civil disobedience was they said, I believe in this. The law is unjust, and I'm willing to go to jail for it. Right. So many protesters today come up and they say, I believe in this. The law is unjust. You can't arrest me. I'm engaged in civil disobedience. It's like, no, you have to be willing to face the consequences of the law. And that's what, by the way, allows the public to either side with you or side against you and say, no, you're the ones who are wrong. That law is just. Yeah. And we're not going to support you when you're arrested.
Right. They actually believe that if they're not physically attacking somebody, that whatever else they do is okay. It's their First Amendment right. But like I said, it's my pet peeve. I felt, as you just described, for years, but I'm still not hearing why you think the tide is turning. What is one or two indications that people are getting fed up? I've been fed up for 20 years with this crap because I used to live in LA and I'd seen them blocking traffic and stuff. And I'm going, just run them over. I hate when they do that. Not only are they bothering people, but they're bothering people who aren't the culprits, right?
Yeah, the evidence for me is anecdotal. I mean, I haven't seen polling data or studies on it, but I feel like I see more and more in social media feeds and commentary and just what I hear from people that people are just saying, we're tired of it, that people are more and more adopting something akin to the attitude you just described. They may not literally mean it. Maybe you do. I don't know. But they are just kind of like more and more like, just drag these people out of the way. Why are we having to put up with this? And we want, law and order here. And I think it's been interesting. One place you really see that have been the protests against ICE, immigration customs and so on. And, I don't want to get into the underlying issue of immigration policy or anything. And I don't want to get into their enforcement practices, but basically they are engaged in enforcing the law and they have been subjected to actual sort of, physical attacks and so on. And despite all the outcries about this, the public polling data, this is one area where Trump's favorability ratings remain, very strong. A lot of people are maybe a little nervous about the tactics ICE is using. Maybe this is going too far, but they aren't flocking over and saying, it's okay to, try to publicly identify these people and harass them or literally attack them or to, blockade them so they can't go about their business. People are not taking the side of the anti-ICE protesters. And if they're not going to do it in that case where, the images can be very emotional to people, these guys in hoods, and kind of paramilitary garb.
Well, that was the other issue you mentioned when
they're not getting it.
I'm sorry to step on you. When Kim asked you that question about issues on the horizon, the other issue you mentioned was in the realm of disclosure. You think that there's some, and I think the Institute for Free Speech, which you founded, is involved in some litigation on that issue too. I don't know if ICE agents wearing masks exemplifies that issue, does it?
Well, it doesn't exemplify what we at the Institute for Free Speech work on directly, but it does exemplify the bigger issue that we do know, that there can be dangers to being out there publicly, right? And in any kind of role. And I run into a lot of people and they say, well, look, I'm proud of my views, and I'm willing to stand up and be counted. But you know what? a lot of people aren't, including other people who may be proud of their views, but they just don't want to live their life worrying about being doxxed or having their car keyed or whatever. They don't want to worry about their kid being harassed at school. They don't want to worry about employees of their small business losing their jobs because somebody boycotts the business because the owner gave $500 to a political candidate or something like that. And I think people are beginning to see this a little more, in part due to some high-profile incidents. So, for example, we had this attack on these two legislators in Minnesota a couple months ago, and of course, we've had other political violence, and then the Charlie Kirk assassination. So, in response to some of this, some states have begun to enact protections for lawmakers' IDs and personal information and so on. I think that's good. But I think there's a lot more people than just lawmakers that deserve that. People, again, who do contribute to campaigns and can be and sometimes are targeted. People who just want to talk about politics. They may want their view to be heard, but they for either their own reasons or because of other people they care about who could be hurt. Like I say, an employer worried about his employees. If I'm speaking, I don't want people to go harass my brother-in-law because it's a way to get at me. And I think people are beginning to wake up to the idea that, this notion, well, the public has a right to know is not all it's cracked up to be. The public has a right to know what goes on in government. They don't necessarily have a right to know everything we as private citizens are doing. And I think people are becoming aware that there is a cost to this excessive disclosure regime. For example, in the area that we work at in the Institute for Free Speech, like in many states, campaign finance laws, you give $10, you're publicly disclosed. And, it opens you up to potential harassment and vandalism to your property and so on. And in this day and age, unfortunately, that's a reality, and we need to be sensitive to it.
I want to show you guys a couple of videos, and kind of harkens back to the issue we were talking about a few minutes ago, which is whether or not you can protest or do whatever has to do with where you are, who controls the property, and so forth. And this is something that involves actually how the police can handle the situation. So I also want Greg's opinion on this as well. Greg was a city cop in Branford, Connecticut, as well as an FBI agent. I don't know if he ever dealt with anything like this. And Brad, I'd like your interpretation of the law. This is a guy who imitates Cuomo, Andrew Cuomo, who's running for mayor. Today's the big election in New York. If anybody has any election results, post it in the comments, please. We're on the edge of our seats. So this is a guy who imitates Andrew Cuomo, and he shows up at Cuomo's events, and he basically heckles him while impersonating him. And the people who work for Cuomo kind of roughly, physically remove him. And I've always wondered why, and I see this a lot, where people disrupt events, and security or whomever at the events often drag people out, get physical, sometimes a little bit, sometimes a lot. And the protesters always seem to just take it. They're always on the defensive. And I've always wondered, well, why don't they go on the offensive? I mean, who says these people who are dragging them out even have a right to do that? And maybe you can clarify who has what right. So let me just show you. There's a couple of different situations here. I don't know what this guy's name is, but I keep seeing his videos.
He's there. He's at the front. Let's go Cuomo! Let's go Cuomo! Let's go Cuomo! Yeah! Whoa! Let's go Cuomo! Let's go Cuomo! Let's go Cuomo! Go Cuomo! Okay. Thank you for coming. Thank you for coming to help me build my advertisements. Here you go. Here. Thank you for coming to help me. I will not take no for an answer. I am Andrew Cuomo. I am Andrew Cuomo. No, please, that man is an imposter. Please. What are you doing? Let go. You're hurting your woman.
What? She's grabbing onto the thing. You hurt women when you sexually harass 13 of them.
I am Andrew Cuomo. No, please, that man is an imposter. Please, no, as a show of loyalty to my billionaire donors, I will now eat the shit.
Don't you ever come back here.
All right. Now, I don't know for a fact that that was a public space. It's possible that that was some sort of a property where Cuomo got permission from the property owner to use it. But let's just suppose, for the sake of discussing it, that that's a public space. that guy who heckled him, you can say he's an asshole, you can say he's obnoxious, but doesn't he have the right to do that? And do those people who dragged him out, if it is a public space, do they have the right to do that? That's the question for Brad. And the question for Greg would be, if you showed up and was confronted with the scenario that I just described, who would you side with? What would you do?
Well, it's a legal matter, Jeff, as you indicated. It's going to be very fact intensive, starting with are you in a public or a private space. If you're in a public space, but it's been reserved, in other words, it's one of these public spaces you can reserve for a party or a rally or whatever, it may take on certain attributes of a non-public space as well that you've reserved.
No, I know, but in my hypothetical, it's a public space.
So if Cuomo is just going out and walking through the crowds, decides to give a speech or whatever else, and somebody else is there heckling him. Yeah, no, I don't think that well, let's flip it the other way. Yeah, I think the heckler has a right to be there and even to engage in heckling. Now, again, he can't, touch or wrestle with other people who are simply trying to hear the speech. And again, we move this into a private setting, and it can clearly be said, if he's speaking at a university or something, look, other people have a right to hear the speaker. That's what they're here for. That's, this is not a public forum. But if it's a public space like that, he's probably protected in doing so. And the security people, could potentially face some type of legal consequences for basically battery, for physically grabbing the guy and dragging him away. Now, even there are caveats. So if the guy is perceived as a legitimate threat to Cuomo, I didn't see anything there that was.
He's a clown. He's a clown, Brad.
Well, we don't see everything that's going on. We don't see that people might, what if he's got maybe it's a toy pistol, but he's got a toy pistol that's part of his act. He's going to pull it out. I just don't know. I mean, there's lots of facts there. I'm always hesitant. Reporters try to do this to you all the time. See, and you're kind of like a reporter almost. I don't mean to insult you here, but
okay.
That is, they say, well, what about this? Is that legal? And it's like, well, there's certain problems that it raises, but I'm not going to try to tell you if it's legal and then have somebody else come back and, point out the representative for the other side and say, oh, well, they didn't tell you about this and they didn't tell you about that. And there's various other facts. So very fact specific, but it's a general rule. Yeah. If you're in a public space, you have a right to heckle people.
All right. So, Greg, you're an officer. You've been called to the scene. Let's say if I were the Andrew Cuomo guy, like I said, the way you saw him react, he's like, sort of just accepting that they're dragging him out and he's continuing in his thing. I might say, wait a minute, you have no right to do that to me. And if there were a cop around, I would go on the offensive. How would you handle it?
Well, in Connecticut, and of course, I'm sort of have to go back in my memory bank on this, but there's two charges that come to mind: disorderly conduct. If it's in a private setting, a breach of peace if it's in a public setting. And there's more latitude, obviously, in a public setting. So if it's an auditorium or an indoor event, and he's disruptive to the point where it's becoming disorderly, my approach would be, you'd get one warning till you have to lower your voice. You're disrupting it to the point where no one can now enjoy what they are here for, to listen to someone else speak. And if it continued, then you'd have to, my position would be like, I am going to place you under arrest for disorderly conduct if you do not stop or you have to leave. So you have three choices: be placed under arrest, leave, or knock off the nonsense. And I guess at that point, the clown would now determine which course of action was going to be employed.
And what if that force was used already by the people that dragged him out? Would you entertain the thought that they had acted illegally? Sounds like your sympathy is with the crowd that's there to hear the politician, not with
in a private venue. Yes.
No, public. I understand private.
I'm sorry. Okay.
Yeah. My whole hypothetical is all about just public. If we just assume.
Yeah, that's a real, that's a real fine line there, because you can, I guess, try to usher him gently away from the scene. If he pushes back, now you're
okay. So let's you brought up another point. Let's say it's private.
Yeah.
How does the person who's being disruptive have to be given some kind of warning, or can they immediately get physical? And is there, obviously you can't, there must be some, extent to how you can't use undue force, whatever that is. But do you first, because my understanding, like with trespassing, for example, which maybe that is, you have to be told that you're not wanted there. But I've seen, like in bars too, like bouncers in bars that just pounce on people and very roughly, and they drag them out. Are they supposed to be given a warning first?
I don't know if there's any rule or law that applies that would cover that scenario. It has to be reasonable, I guess, is what it always comes down to. Was the, should the person have been given a warning first? Yeah, absolutely. You have to stop or you have to leave, or else we're going to make you leave. And then it's kind of in that person's, the ball's in his court. If he continues to be disruptive, then you say, okay, now we're leaving. If he's resisting the escort, then it becomes more physical. And I don't know who's more to blame at that point.
Jeff, I think in some ways, Greg and I are saying the same thing, which is as much as you want to try to get around it, it really becomes very fact specific. And for example, our Andrew Cuomo guy, has he been following Cuomo right on his shoulder, yelling in his ear, for a period of time? And there's just a lot of different little facts.
There may be a harassment statute that applies. Is that
you don't always see the entire thing.
Yeah. Okay, then I'm here basically to represent the assholes of the world. That's what I'm talking about. All right, let's get to more lofty matters like Trump's appeal. This we were talking about this last week. This is the so-called Stormy Daniels case, and there was this guy Brad Smith who Trump's lawyers wanted to testify as an expert witness in that case, but they wouldn't let him. Have you heard about that, Brad?
No, I'm totally unfamiliar with that.
So one of the things they were hinting
in the courtroom, so I missed what happened there.
All right, well, let me fill you in. One of the things they had hinted at in this case was that maybe Trump violated some campaign finance law, specifically the hush money payment was a campaign expense, and he was supposed to have reported it. And I heard a rumor that you were going to testify that no, that actually was a personal expense, and therefore it couldn't possibly have been a campaign finance violation.
Yeah,
seems pretty relevant. Seems to be within your wheelhouse. Yet the judge said you wouldn't testify. What's up with that? Why not?
This is ultimately it gets into a lot of fairly complex statutory interpretation. I don't think we really have time to do it. I think you and I have done a show on this before, didn't we? Didn't we do another podcast?
Yeah, we did. But I mean, it's in the news again now. The appeal. Right. He just filed the appeal.
So to summarize it really quickly, let's put it this way. The basic charge against Trump was that he paid this porn star, Stormy Daniels, so that she wouldn't talk about their affair. And the prosecutor says, oh, well, that's a campaign expense. You had to pay for it with campaign funds and report it as a campaign expense. And I think if you look at the law properly, and actually, if you just think about it intuitively, you're a citizen, and you're a citizen sitting at home, right? Do you think it's a campaign expense to pay hush money to a porn star to cover up a former affair? I don't think it is. And the law is very specific. It talks about campaign expenses have to come out of the fact that you are campaigning for office. Now, a lot of people try to say, well, the only reason he paid her is he was running for office. But that's not the same thing. That's not what created the obligation. And that's what's very clear. So, for example, if you decide you want to run for office, okay, and you decide, well, I want to seal up my divorce records, I want to pay a lawyer to do that. It's not a campaign expense. If you are a business owner and you have a lot of lawsuits against your business, as business owners do, I should say a lot. You have some lawsuits against your business alleging you mistreat employees in some way, right? And you think they're total malarkey. Your lawyer says, oh, we got to take this to trial. You're going to win for sure, right? It's still not a campaign expense. Even if you say to your lawyer, look, I'm running for office. I don't want these suits going to trial. Let's just settle them. I know I'll win, but let's just settle them anyway, right? The only reason you're doing it is because you're running for office. It's not a campaign expense. It's a personal expense. Otherwise, you could use your campaign funds to pay hush money to prostitutes. You could use your campaign funds to do all kinds of things we don't want people using their campaign funds.
Yeah, like as if it would be a good thing to be using this money.
Yeah. And so this is the issue there. The other issue that comes up on appeal, and I mean, Trump raises several issues on appeal, or his lawyers do, that I think are quite good. But the other one,
those are the key issues right there.
Where I think the brief is really strong is that very first bullet, the federal election law supersedes the case, supersedes the state law. The state law, there's no state law violation other than what the state alleges is not reporting something properly, right? What they say wasn't reported properly were payments to Trump's then lawyer Cohen. They were listed as payments for legal services, and the state says, well, they weren't for legal services; they were paid hush money. Okay, now that's not entirely clear to me that if you pay a guy to negotiate a hush money deal for you, that's not legal services. It sounds like legal services to me. Yeah. But Cohen also advanced the money for the settlement. They're saying that should have been viewed as a campaign expenditure and reported as such. Again, for reasons I've just stated, I don't think that's right. But then so the state then says, the government says, therefore you covered up that this was by reporting these as not campaign expenses, but as legal fees. You were covering up the fact that you were violating the Federal Election Campaign Act. And we have another statute that makes it illegal to try to influence an election by illegal means. And so your reporting goes back to the state law that you were trying to cover up the influencing an election by illegal means. And what was the illegal means? It was violation of the Federal Election Campaign Act. That's all pretty complex. So let's try to cut it down to this, right? The Federal Election Campaign Act governs federal races. Trump was running for federal office. State campaign finance laws are not in effect here. In this case, what was clearly the situation was that if Trump was not found by the jury to have violated federal campaign finance law, he walks. If he's found to have violated federal campaign finance law, he doesn't. The fact that you say violating federal campaign finance law is also a violation of state law doesn't get you out of the preemption. It would be like, imagine if Republicans in some conservative state in 2023 had passed a law in Alabama or something saying it shall be a felony under the state of Alabama to commit an impeachable offense by a federal official. Right. And then they said, oh, well, we think Joe Biden's committed impeachable offenses and convicted him. You can't do that. The federal law preempts that. You can't try to get around it by pretending that that's actually a violation of state law. And I think that argument is very strong in the court. And I think Trump is likely to win on appeal for that. And for other reasons as well. They make a strong argument about the bias of the judge who'd contributed to Trump's adversary in the presidential race. And they attack a number of other rulings. But I think the preemption.
That judge, I think, donated about $20 or $30 to Biden's campaign. Would that be an example of the sort of disclosure you don't want because it's a small amount?
Well, yeah, it would be actually, but nonetheless, so there you go. You would have that. It's interesting that he donated that small amount too. You say, well, that doesn't really matter.
He's cheap. He likes Biden, but he's cheap.
I think the reason he did it was to show certain people in New York that he was on the Biden team. I think that's why.
Maybe. You don't have to spend a lot.
He doesn't want to give a lot if he's a judge because he knows judges aren't allowed to make any campaign contributions. But he can do a little bit. He says, oh, well, it's just a de minimis amount, which is exactly what his defense was. And meanwhile, he showed everybody who counts in New York that, he's a loyal player on Team Biden.
Well, why didn't he let you testify?
Well, he would have let me testify, but all he would have let me do is essentially read the statute and not point out a whole bunch of things, flaws, and that again, it gets pretty technical, but why the prosecution's theory doesn't work. The prosecution's theory was that Trump was trying to cover up these payments before the election. And I would have pointed out that under the law, he wouldn't have, even if they were campaign payments, which they weren't, but if they were, they wouldn't have had to be reported until after the election. So there was
slow down. I happen to be aware of this, but I think the average person may not digest that because this brings it to a whole new level of absurdity. Even if it were a campaign expense that he was required to report, which he wasn't, but even if he were, he was not yet required. It's like prosecuting somebody for failing to file their taxes on April 1st instead of waiting till April 15th. Is that kind of?
Let's reorder that sense a little bit. The prosecution's theory is that this should have been a campaign expense, and you did not report it as a campaign expense because you wanted to keep it hidden until after the election. And I'm pointing out that if that was his motivation, he could have treated it as a campaign expense. It still wouldn't have been revealed until after the election, which suggests that clearly his reason for not treating it as a campaign expense was that he did not believe it was a campaign expense. And I think there's good reason for that, in the law, in precedents, and in the fact that the Federal Election Commission, which I was not on at the time, but the Federal Election Commission actually did get complaints about some of this and did investigate it and dismissed it as not being worth pursuing. So yes, it comes down to the fact that if the prosecution's theory was right about federal election campaign law, then Trump had no reason, no benefit from violating that law. So why would he have done it? If the prosecution's theory is wrong, then of course he had no federal election obligations at all.
So the judge would have let you testify, you said, but only to read the statute, not interpret it?
Basically to read the statute, wasn't going to let me say things like the FEC had declined to investigate. And yet, oddly enough, he allowed, for example, Michael Cohen, the prosecution's primary witness, who's not a campaign finance lawyer, to testify at great length about how Trump had clearly violated federal campaign finance law, and they all knew that that's what they were doing and so on. And so, I think that was kind of indicative of the general bias of Judge Mershon. And
it doesn't matter that they all knew if what they were doing was legal. Yeah, they all knew they were doing something.
Or if they thought it was legal, and they certainly had good reason to think it was legal. In which case,
Janine Muniz was our guest on the Whiners last week, where you've appeared on our other podcast. Are you familiar with Janine?
No, I'm not.
She's a First Amendment attorney who had filed a lot of lawsuits against the Biden administration and on issues like the pressure they were putting on social media companies. And she recently changed jobs. She's now the National Legal Director of the ADC, which I think stands for the the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, I believe it stands for. And she is now getting grief from the other side. You know how it is when you stand up for principle on First Amendment issues. Whomever is on the other side says you're a terrible person. So she's getting it from both sides. And she says that, in a sense, the Trump administration is worse than the Biden administration when it comes to First Amendment infringements. Let me play you a clip from what she said the other night.
Yeah, well, I actually think what Trump's doing is significantly worse. It took me a long time to say that because I was like, well, what Biden did was actually more behind closed doors, so it was harder. But it was harder to hold him to account. That was one of the problems with the case we brought to the Supreme Court. Was the court basically said, you just don't have enough proof that your clients were censored because of the government's actions. The social media companies might have decided to censor these people anyway. And you have to show this link. And if the government's sort of operating covertly, it's very hard to show that link. Trump makes it pretty obvious because he's just like, we're going to deport that guy for what he said. So it makes it a lot easier. But I do think the gravity of the punishment that the Trump administration is levying on people, like being put in behind bars, being deported, getting expelled from school. That's much more severe than getting kicked off social media, which I understand. Like, I'm very sympathetic to the fact that some people make their livings off it. To some people, it's not a small deal. But I do think, getting removed from the country and away from your wife and newborn is a more severe punishment than losing your social media account. And that just has the effect of a very severe chilling effect.
One thing that video reveals is I don't have a very varied wardrobe, apparently. I was wearing exactly the same clothes there. But anyway, as far as the legal aspect of it goes, what do you think about what she said, Red? Does she have a point?
Well, let's put it this way. I don't think it's productive to get into the old debates about who started it or who's worse per se. I think really it's behavior that needs to stop. And I do think that the Trump administration has taken a number of actions that I think should worry believers in free speech. I think Trump makes them often seem worse than they are. So somebody might file a routine complaint, a routine FEC complaint well, I disagree with it because I don't think we should have the law at all. The courts have upheld the law, said it's constitutional. This is just a routine complaint. And Trump's likely to find out about it and tweet something like, yeah, we're finally going to hold these crooks responsible, something like that for election interference. And that's not really the issue at all. And, I think oftentimes his impulsiveness there creates a sense that things are worse than they are. Nonetheless, I do think he's done a lot of things that do indicate a desire to retaliate against people who say things that his administration doesn't like. I would tend to disagree with the question. I don't like to get into this, what's worse, but the problem with what the Biden administration did is almost precisely that they were much smoother at it, so to speak. They did it more behind the scenes and more indirectly. And it may be true that, being deported is a big deal. I was an immigration attorney when I started my law practice years ago. So I've represented people in deportation hearings. It's a big deal, right? On the other hand, wholesale censorship of conservative views on a major communicative medium is to me much more long-term threatening to democracy, and dangerous of kind of putting the screws to our entire democratic life and creating the possibility of more individual abuses, such as individuals being singled out in particular cases. So I think when you look at second order effects like that, I'm not sure I would agree with her judgment, but I admire her for taking on. It's funny, the name didn't ring a bell, but yeah, she was active in some of the internet media suits alleging the Biden administration had interfered, pressured organizations to take people off the air, and that was a real problem. And it's nice to see another person with conviction willing to take on everybody.
Yeah, there was a Washington Post major profile on her. I don't know if I can find it. So she's getting a lot of recognition lately. This is the Whiners Substack, and a post that I just published today. So you can check that out at whiners.substack.com. Has some clips from the episode, and the full episode is embedded there as well. So, yeah, no, I know what you mean. We don't have to play Can You Top This, but it is worth pointing out some of the abridgments, if that's the right word, that's going on here. I mean, it's not just what you mentioned. Pam Bondi, not too long ago, claimed that hate speech isn't protected by the First Amendment, which is just absurd. Can she, I mean, does she really believe that? Do you think?
Well, yeah, I don't know. I will tell you, I mean, I find it, I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. I mean, we spent a decade, 2 decades trying to point out to people that hate speech is totally protected. Plus, there's not really even an identifiable category of hate speech. But the humorous side of me looks and says, boy, that Trump administration, they're great. Brendan Carr speaks threatening Jimmy Kimmel's stations, and Pam Bondi says hate speech. And in 2 days, he's convinced the entire army of liberals in America of something I've been unable to convince them to do over 15 years, that hate speech is protected, that the government can't threaten to revoke your license because they don't like what you say on the air. I'm like, he's much more effective than I am at changing public opinion. But it is very alarming, and I have no idea. I don't know Pam Bondi. I have no idea if she was serious, if she was just speaking crazy off the cuff. And you say things, even if you're saying them, you're kind of realizing like that's not going to float. That's not right.
Yeah, right.
But
you don't even have to be a lawyer. I bet half the people in the country know that there's no such thing as hate speech. And of course,
what's alarming is that maybe she did believe it. Yeah, that's the most alarming.
Yeah, I don't know which is worse, not knowing it or lying. I don't know. All right, what about? Go ahead.
I just had one question, Brad, because it's gotten a lot of attention on the news. Is this lieutenant governor, I think out of New Jersey, is it Jay? If I have it right, or he made the remarks about assassinating or putting bullets into the heads of his opponent's children and his wife. And
is that Virginia?
Yeah,
I'm sorry. Yeah, I said New Jersey, but it's Virginia. Yeah, right. And
Virginia is for lovers
and haters, apparently. But I'm just wondering, like, when you talk about hate speech, but now you've crossed a line where you're threatening, actual violence, and I'm trying to understand why, if a I say a civilian or a citizen made that same statement against a politician, he would probably, I'm guessing, be arrested either by the state police or the Secret Service if it was a federal politician. But he's allowed to make that same type of a threat that seems very detailed and specific and violent without any legal repercussion.
Well, as I understand the threat, the comments, he didn't actually threaten somebody. He didn't say, I'm going to kill you. He's saying, oh, if you told me I only had 2 bullets and I had a choice of killing Stalin, Hitler, or this other guy, this Republican legislator or whatever, I'd put them both in the Republican legislator. That's not really, I think, something that most of us would realize as a serious threat, like he's about to do that. But having said that, I think most of us would recognize that as a terrible sentiment. And what was ironic was that he didn't just kind of say it once, in passing. People called him out on it in this private conversation they were having. They said, come on, don't talk like that. You can't. He says, no, I'm serious. That's what I do. That guy deserves it. It's still not really a threat. And the Supreme Court has to think correctly said you've got to be really threatening imminent lawlessness or an actual threat against someone. The government has tolerated, or the court has tolerated, I think, a little bit more leeway with politicians. I think their view being that threats on politicians' lives uniquely threaten our sort of constitutional order in a way that they're threatening you or me or Jeff doesn't do. But
what about Brendan Carr's threat? He's the chairman of the FCC. And when Jimmy Kimmel made a joke that some people found offensive about Charlie Kirk's murder, Brendan Carr made what, according to the dictionary anyway, is a threat. I don't know if it's illegal. Let's take a look at what Brendan Carr said.
There's a very concerted effort to try to lie to the American people about the nature, as you indicate, of one of the most significant, newsworthy public interest acts that we've seen in a long time. And what appears to be an action by Jimmy Kimmel to play into that narrative that this was somehow a MAGA or Republican motivated person. If that's what happened here with his conduct, that is really, really sick. And I've been very clear. They have a license granted by us at the FCC, and that comes with it an obligation to operate in the public interest. And we can get into some ways that we've been trying to reinvigorate the public interest and some changes that we've seen. But frankly, when you see stuff like this, I mean, look, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. These companies can find ways to change conduct, to take action, frankly, on Kimmel, or, there's going to be additional work for the FCC ahead. Obviously, look, there's calls for Kimmel to be.
Well, maybe that's enough of that. He went on for a while. So what do you make of that?
Well, it's kind of interesting first because Brendan Carr has historically been a great friend of free speech. This kind of comment was very much out of sorts with his long career on the FCC before he became chairman. I think it's a very troubling thing, but I think part of the trouble, remember, is that to some extent he is speaking the truth about the law. We give licenses and they have a public interest. And the thing about Kimmel's statement is that it was clearly a false statement as well as kind of a malicious statement of opinion. It was a factually false statement. And so there's some leeway in the law for Carr to say things like that. Now, I still don't think, we don't want to be like picking people out on this one by one kind of basis. We wouldn't have done that if he made the same comment about some, left-wing guy who'd been harmed. But having said that, in some respects, the problem is that there's this huge government power, that the FCC has enormous power over broadcasters, and increasingly there is pressure on conservatives to use this power. They feel like they've been played for chumps for years. They're the ones who say, oh, no, don't do this. Then in comes the Biden administration, and that's exactly what the Biden administration does. And then the Biden administration leaves office, and everybody's like, oh, no, now you guys have to play by all the rules, And I think that puts a lot of pressure on the system. The answer I would like to see, of course, is to take this power, away from the government to move in a different direction. But that's the dilemma that's there, as I see it, is that conservatives feel more and more like they use the power against us, so we're going to use it against them. And it goes back to what I said earlier. I don't think there's a huge value in saying who did it first. The question is kind of who's going to stop it. But I do understand the argument that it's only going to stop if we're willing to use the powers against them that they use against us. And this, I'm afraid of this, by the way. Like one of the things that Trump did that Ms. Yunus was talking about that I think is damaging. He threatened law firms. He said we're not happy with who you represented and that sort of thing. But our organization was approached by a group of left-wing organizations that wanted us to consider, joining a brief critical of the Trump administration. And we said, well, are you willing to put a paragraph into the brief? We'd seen what they wrote, and it was entirely, the Trump's like the worst ever. He's terrible. There's never been anything worse. The Supreme Court has to stop. We said, well, you put a paragraph in saying this accelerating use of lawfare over the past decade to go after attorneys because of their clients. And think of all the Trump attorneys who've been hounded. And there's an organized group that says our mission is to get these people disbarred and so on for representing Trump. And we said, are you willing to put in just one paragraph that talks about that? And we concluded the answer would have been, if we'd asked that, no, that they weren't. And this is what alarms me is I don't think a lot of people on the left, probably true on the right as well, but certainly on the left right now, a lot of people have not come to grips with what the Biden administration did, and before that, the Obama administration and so on. And they just think that Trump is like the absolute worst. And you're kind of like, so are you going to give up these powers? Are you going to do something different when you come back into office? And the answer is no, we're going to do the same thing we did before, because when we did it, it was perfectly legitimate. Those guys were really bad and deserved it. And this is another one of the problems that we are in our current political atmosphere. Is nobody wants to sort of lay down the weapons because they're afraid the other side's just not going to do it. And there's not a way to really enforce any kind of agreement.
Brett, I think also one thing that comes up along kind of dovetails with what you're saying is they love to take the position like, why are you trying to litigate history? That already happened. Why are we going backwards?
Right.
And it's convenient because it's ugly and they don't want to confront it or face it. So they want to advance the conversation, say, we're talking about what's going on right now.
Yeah.
But it completely overlooks the fact that, when, I don't want to say when you or they or whatever, but when they were doing it, they were completely fine with it. And now when the shoe's on the other foot and you point to that behavior, they want to come back and say, well, why are you litigating in the past? That's historical now.
Yeah. And in the case I was talking about, at the Institute for Free Speech, we just said, look, there's lots and lots of people chiming in on this case. These law firms have a lot of resources to defend themselves. And it's a little bit out of our specific wheelhouse on campaign and election speech. And we just kind of said, for us, it would just be a sort of a piling on exercise. I am very concerned about the president's executive orders as they pertain to law firms, but and some of the other ones. But again, without some assurance that there's a recognition on the other side that they can't keep doing these things, it becomes very tough to say, we're going to drop our priorities to take up your priority.
Yeah.
You made an interesting point, which is that this threat that Brendan Carr made was a threat to use authority that the FCC actually has. He did it in the tone of a mafioso guy. We can do this the easy way or the hard way. But when a mafia thug makes a threat like that, they're not threatening to use legitimate authority. They're threatening to commit a crime. Like they walk into a restaurant, which is, of course, the quintessential example. Nice place you have here. It'd be a shame if something happened to it. They're threatening to set it on fire or vandalize it or something if they don't get what do they call protection money. That is a threat to do a crime. But Brendan Carr threatened to use legitimate force. So let me give you an analogy. I mentioned that Greg was a cop in Branford, Connecticut. So let's say some well-known person in Branford had a reputation, deserved or not, I don't know, but a reputation for driving drunk or speeding. And somebody in the Branford Police Department was asked about that. And the cops said, well, if we see him do that, we'll arrest him. Is there a difference? I mean, other than he's not using a mafioso tone to his voice, he's threatening to use the authority the police have. Is what Brandon Carr said, is it worse or different in any fundamental way?
Well, I think that's
for Brad, correct? Yes.
Either or. Anybody who's a human.
I'll let Brad go with that, yeah.
All right.
Well, I think, again, it's kind of a tough scenario. Let's take back to Brandon Carr, right? I mean, it was kind of interesting is if he hadn't said anything, I think it's very likely that Kimmel would have been canceled anyway. In fact, maybe permanently canceled, because I think, Sinclair Broadcasting and I forget the other network that owned a bunch of stations that broadcast the network are both known to have conservative management. And they might well have said, look, we've just had enough. We're just not interested in this anymore. This doesn't appeal to our viewers. There's reason to think that Kimmel's probably losing a lot of money on his show. I don't know if he is, but I think there's reason to believe that, given what we saw when Colbert was canceled and so on. And once these stations said, we're not going to air Kimmel, we're going to preempt him, there's no doubt the network was going to fold. They don't want to run a show that nobody's airing, right? And right. This all might have happened if Carr had not said a word. So it does show that it just might have not been, good.
Smart, yeah, because now you can't tell if it's because of what he said, is what you're saying, right?
Yeah. But it's it's very, very problematic. I don't think he should have said it, and maybe the difference is that here's what's tough to decide. Was he targeting them because the joke was about Charlie Kirk, or was this just something that was a very high profile thing? So of course it passes the regulator's eyes. Of course he sees it. And this looks to him like a violation of the law. And again, we can disagree on whether we should have that law. I don't think we should. I wouldn't be surprised if Brendan Carr doesn't think we should have it, but we do have it. And he says, well, this passed our eyes. So looks like a clear violation. Maybe we're going to have to do something about it. That's a little different than the scenarios. And by the way, I think we have these scenarios both under Biden and under Trump, where, the prosecution of Trump was a great example, where the prosecutors go out and say, we want to get Trump. Let's find some little law that maybe we can use to try to get him and maybe stretch a lot. That's a lot different than an obvious violation that comes across your desk in the morning headlines.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, before we run out of time, I want to ask you about the Citizens United amendment that Shifty Schiff has recently proposed. This is an issue that's been hotly debated. Well, I guess the case was decided in 2010, but it was even a controversy prior to then. Here's what I consider to be, in the shaded part, the key aspect of it. They're saying that speech that's, let me see. Congress and the states shall have power to implement and enforce this article by appropriate legislation and may distinguish between natural persons and corporations or other artificial entities created by law, included by prohibiting such entities from spending money to influence elections. So before we get to Section 4, it seems to me that's what these people, regulation proponents, have been saying for years, and it's just all so incredibly vague. Anything that is about issues of the day could affect an election. Do you see anything different in this amendment compared to what Bernie Sanders was pushing one? Others have been pushing it for years. They never explain what the hell they want to regulate.
Well, you've got a host of problems, and one is that what is speech concerning the election. This is one of the reasons why actually the Supreme Court has consistently struck down a great many campaign finance laws. They've allowed a lot to stand, but they've stricken many because they are vague. That speech about anything that influences the election. Arguably, what we're doing here tonight could influence an election. I mean, we've mentioned politicians, we've talked about issues, we've talked about political parties. And, sometimes when I hear people complain about money in politics, I understand why people do. I think it's a natural thing. People distrust it. It strikes against some of our core ideas about political equality. One of the things this not always an easy sell, but I point out, look, by promoting deregulation, I'm not promoting for you a perfect world, but I want you to consider, I do think there are benefits and I can talk about those, but I want you to consider what the world might be like if we had an amendment like this. And you know how you can consider that? Because Congress passed this in 1974. Congress passed the Federal Election Campaign Act. Much of it was cut down by the Supreme Court, but that law would have limited any group. So if you're pro-life, it's the pro-life. If you're pro-choice, it's Planned Parenthood. If you're pro-gun, it's the NRA. If you're anti-gun, it's Everytown USA. Every group could not spend more than $1,000 on an election or actually anything, quote, relative to a candidate. Relative to a candidate. Just talking about a candidate in some vague way, proposing legislation or whatever it is. It would have limited how much campaigns could have spent to about $60,000 for a U.S. House race. Now, a lot of people are like, well, I would like that. That's good. They shouldn't spend a lot of money. But think about that: 60,000 people in a U.S. House seat. There's over 500,000 voters, right? You've got to reach them with $60,000. Essentially, it would have killed our politics, except for this exception, which you're going to get to, for the press, which would have been free to report and do whatever they want. Now who's got a lot of influence? Big corporations like CBS News and the New York Times and that sort of thing. It's just absurd. And we should bear in mind, that's what Congress will do with this power. And we know that they will do that because that is what they did when they thought they had that power. And Congress said, you can't do it. You can't stifle all political conversation in the United States in the name of preventing people from, spending money.
Yeah, the press, that's like the elephant in the room. And that's Section 4 right there. It says, nothing in this article shall be construed to grant Congress or the states the power to abridge the freedom of the press. So if I interpret it the way, I think what they're doing is they're giving lip service to the freedom of the press clause, but they're not saying enough because they're not defining the press in any new way. Correct me if I'm wrong, but hasn't the Supreme Court repeatedly ruled that we're all the press, in essence, and entitled to press rights whenever we just choose to use mass communication technology? And if we are, that would mean that the regulation would apply to nobody because everybody's exempt.
Yeah.
So they would have to have some new definition of the press, but where is that new definition?
Well, let's start by just backing up for just a second, because a lot of people saying, again, I think it's common sense observation, is to say, well, look, money's not speech, so you can regulate money. The First Amendment protects my right to speak. But if that were true, why would we need to have any clause that mentioned anything about the press? Why would we need to have that, right? I mean, the fact is the press spends money. Suppose we said, well, you can't spend more than $1,000 a year to publish the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or to set up your business on Substack or whatever it is. You can't spend more than $1,000 to send messages to your supporters, right? I mean, we would all recognize that violates speech, just as we'd recognize that you couldn't get around, for example, the right to freedom of religion by saying, well, you're free to believe whatever you want, but you can't spend any money to build or maintain churches, to buy or biblical tracts or, religious pieces to pay pastors. We're just regulating the money. We'd all recognize at a minimum that that's got serious First Amendment issues, on the Establishment Regulation Free Exercise Clause. It's the same with free speech. The reason you need to carve out the press is that the press spends a lot of money to bring you news. But then we get to the second question, and this is the one that you raised, and you're quite correct on, which is the Supreme Court has always said the press was not, when they wrote this in 1791 or whatever, they're not sitting there thinking, well, there are certain people who are members of the press club, and they wear like the fedoras with a little press card, sticking out of the hat band, and they get to speak and nobody else does. Rather, it was you have freedom of speech. And this was understood in those days as my ability to speak, to talk, to get up on the street corner and speak. You have freedom of the press. That's my ability to publish something. It's not something that's limited to a handful of people. If it were, it would essentially be, think about this, a licensing system by which the press gets a license. They can say whatever they want. The rest of us can't. And that's clearly not right. And so the Supreme Court has repeatedly ruled, as you said, that the press does not mean that some group of people who publish newspapers or encyclopedias or something get to talk about politics and nobody else does. The press is the act of publishing in written form your speech. And by the way, think about that, right? We could say, why is writing speech? I mean, speech, this is speech. I'm talking to you. I write something that's not speech, right? And then people say, well, of course it is. You're right. That's right. It's the same way with money is, right? I mean, if I can't write stuff, that's going to inflict, that general notion. Right. So we have the speech, the press, and there's no special clause by which the New York Times and the Washington Post are exempt. And so this amendment is, amazing. Either the Supreme Court, could just interpret it as saying, no, you can't, or everybody can speak still because they're all the press. Or alternatively, the Supreme Court say, okay, we're going to have to come up with a definition now for who is the press. And that's going to include the blog of big, powerful corporations like Jeff Bezos owned Washington Post, because everybody knows the Post is press. But, Probable Cause podcast, I never really heard of that before. You guys don't count. Nothing for you. And that's the problem we're going to have.
But why would it be the court's responsibility to come up with that? I mean, the default position is freedom, right? We can do anything we want, meaning we can say what we want, we can spend money how we want. These people say they have an idea. So it seems to me the burden is on them to come up with it and make some argument about the press. Not say amend the Constitution. We have no idea how to do it. You figure it out.
Well, the point is that they've not said anything like that. So let's suppose this amendment were to actually pass. We'd have that amendment as it's just written. And then what's going to happen? They're going to come after somebody and they're going to try to prosecute them because the person published something on Substack. And the person's going to say, well, I think I was exercising my right to freedom of the press. And now the court's going to have to decide. One way to do it would be to say, that's right. We've always said the press is anybody who wants to publish. And essentially your amendment was meaningless. Or the court's going to have to say, well, we know what you were trying to do, and we think that's constitutional, which would blow my mind, but the court maybe could say that. And then they would have to decide, are these other people count as the press? They would have to make that decision.
But in that legislation that Citizens United struck down, there was a press exemption. So how did they define the press in that applicable statute?
Well, the press exemption
BICR, it's called, right? The by.
Yeah, and it actually goes back to the Federal Election Campaign Act of '74, which included that press exemption. It's never been carefully defined by statute or even by the FEC. The FEC has applied various tests over the years in specific litigation efforts. One thing it clearly doesn't include is if you own the publication, you're the candidate and you own the publication, they don't get the press exemption. That's considered an extension of you campaigning, right? But after that, it's everything's game. And in fact, the court's been pretty broad on that. The court has protected things like the old airline magazines you used to get when you got on a plane, investment newsletters, lots of things like that. And one of the things that triggered the final decision in Citizens United was during oral argument, the government attorneys were asked, they said, well, most books are published by corporations. Are you saying the government could regulate the publication of a book because it's published by a corporation, or a movie, which are created by corporations, And the government's answer, because this was the government position, was yes, we could do that. If a corporation publishes the book and it includes even one.
Well, let's get a little more specific. I don't have the wording in front of me, but I do remember the way, I don't remember which justice it was, but the way the question was put is, what if it was a 500-page book and there was just one sentence in it that said, vote for so-and-so? Could that be censored? And the judge said, well, if it's paid with corporate dollars, yes.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of legal experts agree that was maybe where the case was lost.
Yeah. Yeah. And the court, they'd asked a number of questions then, what about a Kindle book and things like that? And the answer was yes. And that was the government's position. So again, I go back to the point I made at the outset of this part of our conversation tonight. When you sit and think, oh, we want to give the government the power to regulate this more, we do need to think, why do we have a First Amendment? We have a First Amendment because we don't trust the government to regulate these things. And why don't we trust them to regulate? Because we've seen how they'll regulate it.
Yeah, right.
And maybe some person who's much more clever than I or Adam Schiff or these people can come up with some amendment that actually tries to more seriously define all that stuff. But I've never seen it. I've never seen anything that works like that.
Adam Schiff, I think, is more likely to go to prison than he is to come up with a clever solution. Now, you don't even think voting is all that important, right? You wrote an article here, and I forget what the name of this publication is, but you suggest there may be some more important ways to behave in a democratic way, and voting is kind of overrated. Am I doing a bad job of paraphrasing your message?
Push back answer that I said I didn't say it was all that important. I did not say voting is not all that important. Voting is very important.
You're under oath, Brad. What did you say?
But what I do think is that we sometimes in recent years have begun to expect too much from voting. If you're active in the community, as I am, you just see this endless parade of ideas of people pushing, well, if we had ranked choice voting, or we've got to have more ways to vote. People forget in this country, prior to 2000, there were no provisional ballots. Prior to the 1980s, there was no state had no excuse absentee ballot. You had to have an excuse why you couldn't vote on election day. Early voting is a creature of the last 30 years. All of these innovations are new, and they create a certain amount of chaos. And they're all done with this idea that we have to make sure that absolutely everybody has no obstacles to voting. And I think if you look at it, it's very problematic if government were to try to, or if a private group were to try to suppress the votes of an identifiable group. Might be an ethnic group, might be a racial minority, it might be rural voters, it might be high income voters, it might be high education voters. Given what our educated classes seem to think these days, a lot of people might think that'd be a great idea. If you got a PhD, you can't vote, or we're going to make it really hard for you to vote, right? But if you do that, that's problematic. But we're not going to kind of capture some Rousseauian general will. And that's what we seem to be trying to do. We're trying to find the general will that Rousseau talked about. And then that majority could just do everything. If we just could get the voting system right, if we tinker with it enough so that everybody can vote just the right way, we'll do ranked choice voting or open primaries, which are, both brand new developments in the great scheme of things. If we just keep tinkering with it, we'll get it right. And then democracy will really work and everybody will be happy. And how will we know when we've reached that? My party will win every election. That's how we know that we finally got the voting right.
Lowering the voting age to 16.
Lowering the voting age to 16. And then there's this concern about if, what if one or two people can't vote? I mean, we have to have lots of early voting because suppose on election day I get sick or, something like that. And my answer is, look, any one vote doesn't really matter as long as there's not this systematic effort to suppress voters. If you get up on election day and you've got a real cold and you think you're infectious, my advice to you is don't go vote. Don't go get other people sick. It's not worth it. Your one vote has an infinitesimal chance of actually deciding the election. So, you know what? It's okay. I think we have a duty to vote and thus a duty to inform ourselves before we vote. And I think part of that duty to vote includes a duty to think about how, if our candidate wins, that might impact other people who are not maybe like me, not in the same situation as me. But the idea that if I just don't vote one time, that this is somehow some sacrifice of my great right is just not really true. And so we're putting too much effort, too much pressure on voting, and it can't handle it. And we need to think more about other government structures like separation of powers, federalism, the Bill of Rights, things that protect our liberties, right? Against votes, frankly. And we need to think more about our civic life. People no longer join Kiwanis and Rotary and things like that. And how do we participate in civic life and realize that we can't solve all of our problems by voting or by tinkering with the voting system.
Well, speaking of being a good citizen and civic life and all that, this man, Greg Dillon, has been a mentor in a program. What was the name of that program?
Shepherds.
And there is a young man that he mentored through the years and who put together a collage of all their time together. I don't know if that's exactly democracy per se, but that's civic life. That's being a good guy, right?
Trying to.
What about the mail-in ballot? I think it was in that same article I just showed. I'm not sure, but there was a fact you put in there that I was not aware of. Let's see if Greg knows this. You know that there's some mail-in ballots. That's a thing that goes on. Do you know much about how many states do it at all or anything like that, Greg?
I do not know. I mean, I know Connecticut's very big on it, but right. I don't know what it goes throughout the rest of the United States now.
If I were to tell you that there are 8 states in these United States of America that have only mail-in ballot, what would you say? Would you say I knew that? Or would you say
only mail-in?
If I read it correctly. Did I read it correctly, Brett?
That's right. You have to. It's the only way you can vote is by mail.
8 states. I didn't know it either. Look, you didn't know it either, right?
No.
Audience comments, please. Did anybody else know that? 8 states have only mail-in ballots.
Jeff, let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
Do you know off the top of your head if those are considered red or blue states?
Ask Brad, not Jeff. I'm the idiot. He's the expert.
Okay. Brad?
They're a mix. They're mostly blue states, but they do include Utah. Trying to think if I could name all 8 off the top of my head. I'm not sure I could. It's Oregon, Washington, a couple others. So mainly blue, but like I say, Utah, a noticeable exception to that.
Okay.
I wonder if the audience can, if anybody in the audience can comment and just say if anybody knew about this. This is the only comment I see so far. I just blew my mind. I can't believe that I didn't even know that. That's remarkable. How long has it been? Is this something new?
This is also a new thing. The first state was Oregon back in the late 1990s. One of the things I mentioned here, and this is somewhat slightly different argument. I mean, there's a couple things to go on. One is that while I don't think there's a lot of fraud in mail-in ballots, I think people think there's all fraud or wrong. Mm-hmm. There is more fraud in mail-in ballots. This would have been an entirely uncontroversial thing to say up until 2020. Everybody knows there's more fraud in absentee votes or mail votes, right? Kind of the same thing. Secondly, is your vote is less likely to be counted. It's much clearer that more votes that were cast by mail get rejected than votes that are cast in person. And there's a reason for that. If you think about it, when you're in person, if you screw up your ballot, you can go ask for another one. If you do it by mail, a lot of times people they write something in the margin. Here's who I really meant to vote for, something that just gets their vote disqualified. They don't have somebody to help them if they need help. Again, it's not a huge percentage. It's a very small percentage. But it's more. It's about twice as much or more that get disqualified and not counted. So if you're against fraud and if you want to make sure all votes are counted, mail voting's bad. But I think the bigger thing is that, we should think of voting again as a civic duty. It's not something that we do in private. It's part of our public shared life together. And it's actually kind of a good thing for people to have to go stand in line with their neighbors for 10 or 12 minutes. The average American votes in 13 minutes or less, right? To stand in line and think and realize my vote's going to affect that person. And, you know, even though I don't like the way they look and they're probably voting for the other guy, they don't seem like a bad person. They're fairly nice. We've exchanged some pleasantries. You know, they haven't tried to attack me here in line. I mean, I think there's something good about that sort of civic participation in that way.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Makes us think about what it is that we're doing. So I think mail balloting has actually been a destructive thing. And it certainly isn't the driving problem, the major cause, but I think it's a small contributor to the sort of hostile personal politics that we have today.
Well, another thing you don't like is early voting, but let's get specific. Let me tell you the Jeff Norman position on this. I think it makes perfect sense. And I would say the right amount of days for voting to be available would be about 2 to 5 days. That's because you want to strike a balance. On one hand, you don't want to have it so early that people are voting before things might happen that should or could affect their decision-making process. That's ridiculous. But you don't want to make it only one day because then the lines might be too long. You may not be able to make it because of illness or because of work or something. So that's my way of striking a balance between those considerations. 2 to 5 days. What do you guys think?
My view is very much the same. I mean, my ideal system, we would do away with no excuse absentee voting. You would have to say, I can't make it to the polls. Now, by the way, I wouldn't be like, you know, we're not going to be going to your house and investigating and that sort of thing. It's just you have to say, I can't make it to the polls that day. Most people, when they're asked to make a sworn statement like that, do tell the truth. And I think it reminds people that it's part of your civic duty, right? But you can ask for an absentee ballot if you have to work. You know, you say, I have to work, can't make it to the polls. I'm going to be out of town, I can't make it to the polls. I would then, just like you, Jeff, I would have probably about 2 to 3 days of absentee voting, usually right the weekend before the election, precisely for people who discover late in the day, all of a sudden that, oops, now I've been called away at the last minute. I'm not going to be able to.
Yeah, they're not feeling well. They get unexpected work problem came up, anything, you know.
Something like that. So I'd allow a little bit of early voting. You know, I'm not like a super rich on this, but I do think we want to get back to the basic idea that the norm is that you vote on election day and that it's part of your civic duty to do so.
All right, well, let's wind up with somebody who's an extremely sympathetic figure, and that would be Jamie Dimon of the Security and Exchange Commission. You wrote, I hope I have it. Don't tell me I forgot to pull it up, but you wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal that was published, I think, just about a week ago, right?
Yeah.
And you are worried about Jamie Dimon and his friends not being able to donate enough money. Now, I'm kidding, of course. Oh, here it is. This is there's Brad's. You co-wrote it with Daniel, what's his name? Schuckman, October 24th, just a few days ago. Why is this guy a sympathetic figure that should be allowed to influence elections with tons of money?
Okay, so Jamie Dimon, for those who don't know, is the chairman of Citibank Corporation, J.P. Morgan Citibank, right? Or is it Chase? J.P. Morgan Chase, I guess it's J.P. Morgan Chase. I'm sorry. So he's the chairman of J.P. Morgan Chase, and he was in an interview in which he made the point. He said, "I cannot speak out on what I believe about New York politics." Right now, actually, he can say things, but it is true that he cannot contribute financially, for example, to this race that is going on today, where the city is probably going to elect a communist to be its mayor, right? And Jamie Dimon is limited, as are virtually all of his employees, in their ability to contribute financially to the race. Now, the reason for this is not something Congress has ever passed. It's just an SEC rule, a Securities and Exchange Commission rule, that says basically that if a company makes any bidding for public investment contracts, right, investment of pension funds or other things like that, then essentially no employee can give more than as little as $150 in any race for that office. And it's been interpreted so broadly. And the penalty, by the way, is it means that for 2 years, you can't get any of that business. So your business falls apart. You get 2 years, you just lost your entire business, right? So most companies therefore say quite rationally, nobody is allowed to give. You're not allowed to give to any race for a state officer, state controller, even a state legislator. You have a state legislator who sits on the committee that affirms confirms the appointment of the guy to sit up as one of 9 members of the state pension board, they're going to say, if you gave money to that one state legislature on the committee that confirms the guy appointed by the governor to be one of 9 members of the pension board, you're out. You can't do any more business with the state for 2 years. And we think that's a pretty gross violation of rights. And we point out that people like Jamie Dimon do have constitutional rights too, but okay, you don't like Jamie Dimon. He's rich, he's powerful. He has lots of employees work for him. And a lot of them, they just care about things. They care about, maybe it's gerrymandering. Maybe they care, they care about healthcare or whatever it is. And they essentially can't support the candidates they would like. And it's worse even than you think, because there's a 2-year look back period. So if you're not working in the financial services industry, or you're working for a company in the industry, more likely, that doesn't do business with the state, and you make a contribution, you have now meant that you cannot get hired by JP Morgan Chase or any company that's doing business with the state for 2 years, because if they hire you, the 2-year look back kicks in and they're out of business. So it also limits the job opportunities of young employees and that sort of thing.
And you mentioned in the op-ed that no other profession faces laws like this. For example, real estate developers do business with governments as well, but they can donate what they want, right?
DEI contractors, road builders would be a bigger one. All kinds of people, cleaning crews that clean government buildings. There's all kinds of employers, that remove trash, that provide utilities and that sort of thing. That they're perfectly allowed. The presumption is not that they are trying to win this contract by corrupting people with contributions of a couple $100. But for the Securities and Exchange Commission, apparently they think if one gives $300, you're potentially corrupting the system, and that's why you're doing it. And it's just not true. And note that this was never passed by Congress. In fact, Congress has higher levels. Most states, and every state actually, has higher levels that you can contribute. So the SEC is essentially substituting its judgment for the elected officers as to how much people should be legally allowed to contribute.
All right. Well, let's remind folks, we've been flashing it on the screen periodically throughout the show, but let's just mention it one more time. You are the founder of the Institute for Free Speech, and the website is at ifs.org, and they can follow you on X at Commish Smith. Anything else that you want to say before we say goodnight?
Yeah, I just say that this is the 20th. Tomorrow we're having our 20th anniversary party for the Institute for Free Speech in Washington, D.C. And I just want to thank all our great staff there and the people who have supported us over the years. And I hope that some viewers will be curious enough to look it up. Thank you, Jeff.
Oh, and where do you live? Ohio or something like that?
I actually live in Ohio. Yeah, I live in Galena, Ohio.
Are you there now, or will you be going to Washington for the party?
I am. I'll be going to Washington in the morning. The willingness of TSA workers to come to work unpaid, depending.
Right. Now, that was you gave that information up willfully. This is not like a compulsory disclosure that we just said what state you're in, and we won't get any more specific. Somewhere in Ohio. Somewhere in Ohio with some very nice paneling behind you.
Yeah.
All right, well, have fun tomorrow. After that second or third drink, then we'll see if you start calling lawyers you don't like scuzz bags, and who knows what'll happen. But we won't see it. Just you and your friends will be there.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Greg.
Safe travels.
Thank you very much. All right, take care, everybody. And don't forget, tomorrow night we're going to have Scott Ritter on Ask the Inspector at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Thursday night, we're going to have The Whiners, and our guest will be James Howard Kunstler, one of my favorite writers. So check it out. Take care, everybody. Have a good night.
Good night.